Good evening and welcome to Worldview, the international affairs show that brings you the views and news that other networks can't or won't tell you about. I'm Alan Mendoza. Our show tonight, Islamic radicalism in the UK. Is British foreign policy to blame? Well, in case you hadn't noticed, last week the long-running debate about attitudes within the British Muslim community once again sprang into life with the publication of a report by the policy exchange think tank entitled Living Together Apart. Among its many conclusions, the seemingly worrying one that there's an increasing radicalisation of opinion among British Muslims, particularly the younger generation, with support for living under Sharia law in significant proportions and also admiration for Al-Qaeda. The report concluded that it was actually multiculturalism, a failed policy to that extent, that was to blame, and this was seemingly endorsed by Conservative leader David Cameron in a speech last week. However, British Muslim leaders have on many occasions previously suggested that it's a worrying disenchantment with British foreign policy that has led to increasing radicalisation. Still others have pointed to developments within the Muslim community itself, or a policy of self-radicalisation. So what is the truth? Well, we're here to find out tonight, and joining me in the Worldview studio, I have author and commentator Douglas Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, and Ruchul Tarafdeh from the 1990 Trust. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this rather very interesting topic that's sort of just sprung up again out of nowhere. Policy Exchange have, of course, done this report that you've all seen, that I think many people at home have seen as well. I'm going to start with you, Ruchul, because I know you've got strong views on the subject. You've been involved in surveys and such like. Just looking at the survey as such, I mean, what's your view of it in totality?
Well, I think a lot has to do in the way that questions are asked. And, you know, if you're asking somebody about Sharia law can mean a whole range of things. And, you know, it can be something like, you know, divorce laws, you know, things like that. So when people say they support Sharia law, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily saying that we support the beheading of, you know, somebody who's just shoplifted, you know, at the local shop. So there's a lot of context that needs to be put with the questions. And I would actually... I'm not sure, you know, who exactly that the Policy Exchange spoke to, but in the surveys that we've conducted, our figures were in complete contrast to the findings of the report by the Policy Exchange. But unfortunately, you know, when a report is saying something positive, it doesn't seem to get the same kind of media attention.
As a negative one. Just take your point on the framing of the questions. Were your questions framed in a certain other way to get a result? I mean, it's often said that obviously findings are dictated a lot by the questions.
Sure. I mean, we think we asked quite open questions just to see, you know, the reasons for radicalisation. And the vast majority, 94% of people said that it was as a direct consequence of foreign policy that they felt that radicalisation has taken place in the UK.
That's interesting. Now, Douglas, I mean, you've read the report. A lot of headlines have been going on about certain attitudes among, say, the younger generation. Is it a fair report, would you say? I mean, have Ruchul's sort of questions been answered within it?
Well, I mean, it's true that there are always problems with taking surveys. As far as I understand, I'm sorry the authors of the report aren't here, but as far as I understand, they've drawn a fairly wide-ranging and fairly significant in size pool of young Muslims and older Muslims to question. So I don't think that the range of the questions is in doubt. What is interesting is that even if some questions might have been framed in a particular way, I don't think they were, incidentally, but even if they were, the same pattern does emerge in every single question asked. This is, again, this goes through all social attitudes, all attitudes toward the state. The same pattern that crops up time and time again is the fact that it is a young age group, roughly the 16 to 24 age group, that is most radical, most hostile to the British state, most hostile to our foreign policy, most hostile to what I regard as being liberal values which are not open for negotiation.
Right, so that pattern emerges regardless of the questions.
It's there every time.
Craig, you've also seen it. Is that a fair characterisation?
I must say, when I first saw the report, I was taken aback, because I spend a great deal of time speaking with Muslim community organisations, literally been to dozens of meetings with Muslim community activists around the country. And I just don't find those kind of radical extreme attitudes as at all common among young Muslims. I certainly agree that younger Muslims are probably on balance a little bit more radical than older Muslims, but that's true of younger people of any society tend to be a little bit more radical than older people in any society. That's not unusual. But it seems to me that there's a need not to over-dramatize or over-headline. I mean, the percentage of young Muslims who wish to take any kind of violent action against a state is minimal, absolutely tiny, or who would support violent action is absolutely tiny. And it seems to me that the important thing is, people are perfectly entitled in a democracy to disagree vividly with our foreign policy. They wish to disagree with our foreign policy. Actually, Muslims aren't that different to non-Muslims, because the majority of non-Muslims disagree with our foreign policy too. What we need to do is give people...
94% of Muslims regard foreign policy as going in the wrong direction.
No,
I mean, that's a bit, probably more than the general population.
That is more, but it's not massively more.
Yeah, I think the general... Sorry to interrupt. I think the general population is about 67%. So it's not that drastically different. The point that you're making, that the majority of people in the country are, dissatisfied with foreign policy. When it comes to supporting terrorism, it was less than 1% of people who, in our survey, who said that they supported the July the 7th bombings, which again is in quite contrast to a lot of other surveys that seem to suggest a lot higher figure. And one other point I just like to say is that I do a lot of work within communities all around the country, and I've just come back a couple of weeks ago. I was doing a lot of work in Leeds, in Beeston, where the July 7th bombers were from, and in a lot of other areas across the country. And I meet a lot of angry young people, young Muslims, but in terms of supporting terrorist activity in the UK, I've never met anybody who says they, support something like the atrocities of the July the 7th bombings. There's people who are very, very angry and see what's happening in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places around the world, and they would see them as resistance movements and support the resistance against occupation. But that's quite different to supporting terrorism committed here in the UK.
Douglas, you're looking sceptical.
Well, several things. Firstly, generally in surveys carried out in the last few years in Britain, and certainly since the 7th of July, it's usually been around the 2% mark of Muslims polled who approve of or emulate or would themselves say they would take part in an attack like the 7th of July. Now, admittedly, that's a low percentage, but if we're dealing even with 1%, let's say in the margin of error we put it down to 1%, we're still dealing with, in that case, tens of thousands of people living in the British state who are willing to kill other people who live in this state simply for the crime of living in Britain. Now, so that's an important thing to state, first of all. Secondly, on the issue of the general public versus the Muslim community polled on these things, in actual fact, as a Spectator poll showed recently, the general public it is true that over the 50% tend to be critical of the government's policy in Iraq. That's not the same thing as being critical of the government's foreign policy in general. In polls that if you take Iraq out of the equation, people are far more supportive. And what's more, the Spectator poll showed that although they don't particularly want our present government or future government to be connected with the American government in such a clear way, the very vast majority of the British public want a tougher stance against Islamism, a tougher stance against the jihad, and want this war to be waged generally harder and better.
I mean, I think the context has been made that, that this is a war on jihad and so on, but for the vast majority of people that are living in Afghanistan or in Iraq, they're seeing this as self-defense against occupation.
No. That's not a fair thing to say. The situation in both Iraq and Afghanistan are different situations, as we know. But the situation in Iraq is and has been for a long time not a war against occupying forces, but now, and has been for a long time, a war against the democratically elected government of Iraq, against the Iraqi people, by insurgents, by terrorists, by religious fanatics and fascists.
Well, that's meaningless propaganda.
That's not propaganda.
It is meaningless propaganda. You can't have a democratic election when you have 150,000 foreign troops in a country.
Why did that not happen? Did 8 million Iraqis not turn out to vote? Did they not turn out?
Are you saying the Germans haven't had democratic elections for years because they've had...
Plainly that's going to skew the results of any election. But
sorry, Craig.
We'll
come back to that. Yeah. How on earth can you justify that comment?
You can't have normal political campaigning. I mean, all the conditions for normalcy and fair and open election weren't present.
I can tell you there'd been a much less normal election if those troops hadn't been there keeping the peace.
Possibly, but if we can leave Iraq to one side for